My name is Christina Louie, and I work with the Chinese American Heritage Foundation. Welcome to the 29th of 31 presentations of AAPI Talks celebrating AAPI Heritage Month. This event is sponsored by the Chinese American Heritage Foundation. The CAHF is dedicated to celebrating the rich history of Chinese Americans' contributions to the American spirit. For information and to learn how you can participate, visit our website at cahf.us. This Zoom webinar is being recorded. And tonight we will be hearing from Rev Dr Ken Fong. Reverend Fong grew up at the second oldest Baptist church among Chinese, west of the Mississippi in Sacramento, California. Until retiring in 2017, he led Evergreen Baptist Church of Los Angeles, a historical Japanese American church, to become one of the very first English-only Pan-Asian multi-ethnic church in America. He also helped found Fuller's Asian American Center and taught Asian American focused classes there. We will also be hearing from a few panelists tonight that Reverend Fong will introduce. Thank you everyone for being here tonight, and please take it away, Reverend.
Thank you so much, Christina, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for tuning in. We are in for a treat tonight. The panelists that I've been able to assemble on this Memorial Day weekend are very knowledgeable, and this is really around a question that it really resonates with me. So let me share my screen with you. Okay. Oops. There we go. It's what roles has Christianity played in our AAPI communities? And I just wanted to share a couple slides before I introduce our first speaker, because there are some really deep reasons why I resonate with this question. One of them has to do certainly with the fact that I pastored, as Christina said, a historic Japanese American church for nearly 40 years. So even though I'm Chinese American, third generation, I'm married to a Japanese American. The fact that I pastored a church where most of the older Japanese American people, when they were kids, they actually got rounded up, unjustly put into those incarceration camps. And I spent that time learning a lot of the stories of how important their churches were, whether it was a Catholic church or a Protestant church, to get them through the dreary, tough life there in camp. So definitely, I was part of a church where Christianity and the community of the church really was central to them getting through tough time in life. But I also resonate with this question because the Christian church has been a part of our Fong family for 4 generations. This is one of my favorite pictures. Again, our church that I grew up in, I think it was started around the time Abraham Lincoln was president. But in 1934, it was called the Chinese Baptist Mission. And I love the fact that you can see, this is my dad. He's probably like 10 years old there. And this is my dad's youngest sibling, my Uncle Henry, who's now the only survivor. He's 90. But it really grounds, this picture really grounds my family's history in the long role that the church and the Christian faith have played in our lives. Starting with my paternal grandparents and their 5 children. Again, there's my dad. But it was Baptist missionaries in China that actually converted my grandparents and even taught my grandfather how to speak English before he came here as a young teenager. But then my father, my mother became Christians, and my 3 siblings and myself. So that's the next generation. I became a pastor. But I also resonate with what we're going to talk about because the last part of this webinar, we're going to not look backwards, we're going to look forwards. And my wife and I are not sure what, if any, role it will have in our daughter's life, who's about to graduate from a Christian college, but as one of those kind of millennial Gen Zers, she's got a lot of issues, a lot of questions with Christianity and the church that is pretty representative of her generation. So I'm looking forward to the conversation that we're going to be having following the panelists, because I think that we can't take the future for granted. Okay, that is, I'm done sharing my screen here. Let me get out of here. There we go. With that, I want to introduce our first panelist. It's Rev Dr Bayer Lee, who is the pastor of the First Chinese Baptist Church. He's also the consulting pastor of First Chinese Presbyterian Church. These are in New York City. He's a former Fulbright grantee, researcher at the Elbenwood Center and the Teachers College at Columbia University. And I've asked Bayer to particularly focus on the role that Christianity has played among the Chinese in the New York City area. So welcome, Bayer.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I'm from New York City. We've been trying to connect with the West Coast because most of the information I learn about Asian American studies is from the West. Our New York Chinese congregation or the community is not that much involved. In fact, I serve a church and many years ago when I began to explore this idea of Asian American heritage, I didn't have any resources to look into it. So I started with the museum. And then I began to talk about it. And I took a trip to Toisan in 1991 when my mother passed away. And I was curious where she came from. So my aunt said, Bayer, you got to come with us. We're making a trip from Chicago, Des Moines, to your mother's village. And that's how I began to look into this issue of where I came from. I was born in Hong Kong in 1950. I guess growing up in Hong Kong, we always thought about the British, the American, the Western people. We always want to go to America. And at the time of the 1950s, China was going through this revolution. It was a place to be feared. Nobody wants to go back, let alone explore the roots. So I came to New York and I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood. I always wanted to be American. I thought these Jewish friends of mine, they were American. Well, it turned out they're Jewish, but they're American. And so when I grew up in high school, I was sort of trying to figure out who I am. Always want to be part of the white culture, maybe get a nose job or become American. My sister was a Christian and my brother-in-law, they kept in touch with me and finally they dragged me to the church in Flushing. And that's how I began my connection to Christianity. This was a time of the late 60s, early 70s, where after the Lausanne conference in, I guess, 74, they were recruiting people for the next generation. Well, it turned out that I went to a missionary conference, 1975, at the church my brother-in-law passed in Flushing. I raised my hand, I stood up when the missionary issued a call, like a Macedonian call. That's how I came to serve God. And then they sent me back to Hong Kong in 1976 for the first Congress, Chinese Congress on World Evangelism. And so that's sort of my entry into the Christian faith. And I began to go to a church in Chinatown because someone invited me from my school. And that's how I entered into American-born Chinese ministry in Chinatown in the early 70s. Now, I wanted to just briefly mention about this AAPI. I'm not sure when that was constructed because I'm not sure too many people in my church, both English speaking as well as Chinese speaking, apply that term to themselves in terms of being Christian. I'm in connection with two communities. One is the English speaking Chinese. Some of you might know Howard Chan, John Ng, he came out west for a while, he's retired. And I'm also part of the Chinese speaking ministers, about 80 of us. Most of them are pro-Trump. Many of them went to the Valley. They organized one man, one wife demonstration in DC. So I find myself in a very kind of curious situation of where do I fit in this spectrum of spiritual community. And the English congregation, the English ministry has somewhat disconnected. At one time we had meeting with Palm, Howard Chan, as some of you may know, and COVID came and we kind of, never really met that much. And many of my English pastor friends have retired. Congregation in China has diminished. In fact, 2 congregations died. Conservative Baptists, the English ministry that people I knew who are now 60s and 70s, they just left. They went to American churches. 2 or 3 of them. One of them is trying to connect with the Reformed Church of America to save the congregation. So I don't know, but at the same time, the Fuzhou Chinese friend of mine, who's an elder, just mentioned a spectacular growth. 5 churches, 15,000 people. They got 1,000 kids that speaks English, 800 of them. They don't know what to do with them because they don't have the English ministry. They're trying to scramble to hire pastors. So it's an interesting experience. Now, I want to stop before I go any further. I want to mention, let me know the time. The term AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander. I was involved in the AAAS, Asian American Association for Asian American Study in the late 80s. I was recruited by Professor Hume from Hunter College. My first exposure to the speaker were Professor Ronald Hockey and Gary Ogahiro had came. And both of them were influenced by the Bandung conference in the 1950s, when the alliance between Asian, and African began this coalition. And so they studied their PhD and studied in Africa and other Latin American country. And then the idea of this coalition among the 3 by Mao called AAPI, Asia, Africa, and Latin. Well, that turned out to be the impetus for the 1969 demonstration at the University of California, and the one that started this program of ethnic study. And to compromise, because the term 3 or third world study is essentially Marxist or Maoist, and the term Asian American was substitute. That's part of the more acceptable. Now, so I was part of the AAAS until a few years ago when the organization denounced Israel, tried to, not include the Israeli educational system in the culture. Now, also they are concerned about the American, who is part of this sort of invading the Arab world. Now, so the whole idea of this, so in 1996, in New York and NYU launched the APA, Pacific Asia is AAP. We don't have that, APA. And that was Professor Jack Chan. And we used the, out of that, that was the first time I saw Professor Dr. Lani Deng and Gary and Jack. They produced this episode called Ancestors in the Americas. I used that extensively. The problem with that series was that when I showed the film to white students, they feel very uncomfortable because they were, denounced as imperialists, particularly Christian, try to come into Asia under the gunboat and part of the opium trade. And so this concept is rather difficult to for for the churches here, and when I more involved with the community, many of my conservative Christian, in fact, I was told by a church to leave because the question said, if you want to go that route, you do your research, but this is what we are not here to do, the evangelical community. So I wanted to share that, difficulty. So the next, I don't know how much time I have, I want to share the story of two churches. The one I currently pastor and the one I consult in, plus other things, right? So 1807, big date. The ship that came from New York City near Chinatown off the South Sea Seaport was named Trident. This was the only passage that Robert Morrison was able to find that allow him to take a safe passage to Macau. And because of his connection to Macau, the adjacent west part of the Pearl River Delta was able to connect, like Yong Wang, right, who went to Yale, and many of others who came even in the early 1820s and 30s to New York City because they came through the boats, the ships. And my ancestor, Toy San, were coming as well because of proximity. So there was a pastor named Hyepin. This is a pastor that started First Presbyterian Church in Chinatown. It's a United Mainline Presbyterian Church. He started in 1910. Before that, the church started under this conflict of whether the church should preach the biblical, salvation story only through giving out tracts and Bible, or should the church be caring for the needs of the people? So in 1867, there was a missionary who came from the West Coast. He was a Presbyterian minister. He started a ministry to the Chinese by holding Chinese New Year party. And was having a Chinese New Year or Thanksgiving party to include the Chinese, about 60 or 70 who was in the 5 Point. In fact, they started a training for Chinese servants. There's a picture, I don't have time, but it looked like they were waiters, but no, they were not waiters. They were being trained so that they could enter into this houseboy industry for the Uptown Presbyterian. Now, out of that connection, Reverend Hyepin started the church with the Presbyterian. They went uptown. So the Presbyterian Church became a mainline denomination, very much focused on politics. Reverend Hyepin had 10 children, 6 of her daughter married a Chinese scholar, and they went back to China and became players, right, in the formation of the Christian educational political institution. So Christianity gave them really a ticket or access to the global politics, particularly in China, supported by the American. The second minister I want to share with you is Reverend Lee Tao. He was a Baptist. He came to the West Coast again and came to Christ, and he became a missionary, and they sent him back to New York City, and he started a mission called Morning Star Mission with the support of the American Baptists, Reverend Sears, quite a influential individual who started the outreach to Chinese in the 1910s. And Reverend Lee Tao had a daughter, no son, and he died in 1924, in the process of organizing peace conference for the Triad, who were the warring faction among the clan, and he passed away. He had a stroke or some kind of illness. And the daughter, Mabel Lee, who came to New York City in 1900 when she was 3 years old. She went to the public school system. In fact, that was a time when the subway system allowed her to go to a progressive school called Erasmus High School. And that's where she came to know the faculty who taught her and got her involved in the women's suffrage movement. And so in Fort 12, she was mounted on a horse, marching down on Fifth Avenue with the women's suffrage movement. While many of the Black were put in the back, some of the Chinese were able to be participating in this frontage march, and she became so-called famous. And currently, there was a lot of interest in her story because of the 19th Amendment. Book has been written about her, and she became a scholar. She got her PhD from Columbia in 1921, the first Chinese woman perhaps to do so in any US institution. And in 1925, her father passed away, and she came back from possible deanship in China, Xiamen University, and she took over her father's work, and until she passed away in 1966. And before I end, I wanted to share, remember a friend of mine, a friend of Ken as well, as I'm sure many of you know him, Corky. Corky, I knew Corky because his wife had cancer, prayed for him, but he never knew me. 7 years ago, I drafted him into the American Legion because he used to take pictures. And he was against the war in Vietnam, so he was sort of looked upon as someone who's opposing the military. But I got him in there because his father was a veteran. And so Corky said, well, you got me into the American Legion. Why don't you open the church? So I did. And he started showing film. The first film he showed was Anime Wong. And for 7 years, he opened the church to the community. He showed film. He brought all his friends. That place was packed. I never knew all his friends. I got to know so many people in this AAPI community, and his inspiration for me to continue to play a part and to be part of the community, which I think I'm probably the only one of my friends who are conservative, evangelical. I graduated from Dallas. Can you believe that? Then I went to a very liberal education teachers college, and my advisor was from Union, and I was a supervisor of an intern from Union a couple of years ago. I am a mixed bag, totally confused, and I'm not sure the church, the Christian community, where it will go in the future. But I do want to say that our personal stories, our parents, this ancestors, see, the evangelical community is so scared of ancestors. In fact, the largest church in Chinatown, Overseas Chinese Mission, right? They spent $10 million renovating the building.
Okay, Bayer, I got to cut in here.
They threw away the picture of the pastor. No, yeah. They threw away his archive. Okay, then I end.
All right, well, thank you so much for sharing. I got to get to our second panelist. This is the Reverend Hyepin Im. She's the president and CEO of FACE, which stands for Faith and Community Empowerment. She is a Korean American, and I invite you now to share. Got to unmute there.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Ken. I didn't realize when I accepted the invite that it was during Memorial Weekend. So kudos to all the speakers here. Again, my name is Hyepin Im, and I run a nonprofit called Faith and Community Empowerment. And it's my pleasure to share a little bit about the Christianity, the role that Christianity has played in our community. I want to first start off that the US missionaries were responsible for bringing the first Koreans to the United States, and they were brought to the sugar plantations of Hawaii in 1903. And there was about 100 of them, a little over 100, that came actually from two churches, a Presbyterian church and a United Methodist church, because it was facilitated by those two missionaries. And it was only today that I was doing a little research because I know that the Japanese were there before the Koreans and actually even the Chinese. So I thought, you know what, I'm just kind of curious, did a little research. And it seems that the children of US missionaries, so this is before Hawaii became official territory or state of the United States, had gone to the Pacific islands, and apparently there's something called the Big Five, and many of them were children of missionaries who eventually controlled the sugar plantations. And I guess that's part of the reason why I was curious why US missionaries would facilitate immigration to the United States. And also a backdrop in terms of, again, what happens in our home country leads to our lives here and immigration to the United States. So in the 1900s, Korea was also taken over by Japan. And many of the US missionaries at the time were supporting because it was led by a lot of Korean Christians in the independence fight. And it was interesting in that during that period, the Japanese government pressured the US missionaries to pull in the rein of these Christian pastors and leaders. And so part of it was to hire, I guess, evangelists to go travel around the country and preach that good Christians don't get involved in politics and that they keep their faith private and personal. And so that was kind of another piece that I found very interesting as well, and has greatly influenced perhaps maybe less of the political activism of Korean Christians here, even in the US, although it doesn't say that it's always permanent and consistent. There's moments that they do get very active as well. The other piece that I would say is that the first South Korean president was also Christian. And at a time when Korean Christianity rate was only 2%, that he ended up in prison, not because he was Christian, but because of his political activism. And there was one prison that they were all sent to. It's kind of like with the Black community when they were doing the protests and they were all sent into a certain prison. And so actually, I think there was about 20 or 30 of these leaders, activists, all in one prison. And that's where Syngman Rhee, the first president, prayed for this country. And he had come to the United States to study, and the long-standing relationships that he was able to foster here in the United States led to US actually getting involved in the Korean War as well as Japan. So there is also that backdrop. And then one last piece connected with South Korea. Part of my heritage is that my grandfather basically got to know a US missionary and became a Christian. And his family, so it would be my great grandmother. So my grandfather's mom was a very dedicated, like a Shinto believer. And every day they would be doing this shamanistic activities and have all kinds of hanging things and etc. And I guess my father-in-law my grandfather got sick and tired of that, and he had heard that if you become a Christian that you don't need to do any of that stuff. And one day I guess he disappeared, and the family was in uproar of like where he had gone. And I guess maybe at dusk somewhere along the way, my great-grandfather was on the lookout, and my grandfather from a distance came forth. And basically, as he started to come near the home, he bowed to his father, and then he started to tear down all the Shinto type of shamanistic, I guess, paraphernalia. And he took all that into the home and started to burn everything. And my great-grandmother started to die, and she did die. And just as, but my grandfather refused to stop burning. And then basically he went to give his last respect. And my great grandmother came to life again, and she became a Christian, and she helped to establish the first church in that village. So that's part of my journey. And here in the U.S., my parents, started to attend a Korean church. And through that, they started to believe in God in a more dedicated way, and eventually became a pastor. And then basically they started a ministry, and they thought they were going to preach the gospel, lead many people to Christ and to salvation, and for which they did a lot of that. But they also ended up becoming really unpaid social workers. And that kind of is the reality for the vast majority of, I would say, houses of worship, but particularly in the Korean community. It's interesting that in South Korea, only 20-30% are Christians. But when they come to the United States, that number jumps to 70-75%. And particularly, I would say Koreans have one of the highest language barriers. And particularly because of the U.S. missionary facilitation of Korean immigration to the U.S., the church has always served as a haven. They thought they were coming to the U.S., to the sugar plantations, to find paradise, but they found and met indentured servitude. And in essence, for the first many years, they were not able to get married because of laws. And so eventually they brought picture brides, and that's how they were able to establish families in the US. So they're very lonely, very horrific lifestyle in the plantation, and the church served as a haven. And so I do want to say that even in the early immigrants, many people plan to go back to their home country, but also the door closed on them per se. But in addition, because of the independence movement that was happening outside the country, the churches, particularly the Korean women, would sell bottles of kimchi to fund the independence movement as well. So again, churches have played a very significant role. And I remember when we first started our organization in 2001, that I didn't have any major staffing or funding, and I needed to get the attention of policymakers, particularly, again, even though there is the model minority myth, Asians in many ways, especially when you disaggregate the data, are in need of resources and are suffering, just as my parents found out that they have to help so many people with driver's license, with housing, jobs, etc. And yet I would say currently, even to this day, Asians continue to be left out. I'm very grateful for this new awakening from the country that Asians are also suffering from discrimination, and that many subgroups need assistance. And I think the recent establishment of the Asian American Fund that's pulling resources, etc., is so critical and important. But when we were starting this effort, really very little attention was given. And what I decided to do was I found this article in one of the Korean newspapers that showed that it was a survey, an annual survey done here in Southern California, and they highlighted the offering and the attendance of the top 16 mega churches. And at that time, the membership ranged from 1,000 to 6,000, and the offering was, 1,000 to 4,000, and the offering was $1 million to 6.9 million. And whenever I would approach funders, they would they would go from, how can I help you, with this very disdain look, to one of genuine excitement, realizing that the church has this major power connection to bodies, warm bodies, as well as even funding. And I have to say a shout out to, one example is the senior pastor of Oriental Mission Church. But he is just one example of many efforts, many churches across the country, and there's about 5,000. But this pastor, he was in essence with his wife, who actually did all the hard work of working hard while he did the ministry, but in essence helped fund a lot of the secular institutions, from Korean language schools to Korean associations to a lot of even scholarship funds after the LA riots broke out. And so at key historic moments, churches in our community have played such a significant role. And so in that way, I would say that the conservatism of our Korean Christian churches are evolving. And whenever there's unique situations where they feel that it is God that people are fighting against, they seem to jump in. But that definition of what fighting against God means could be unique. I think the investment of the first generation into the second generation faith, even though many of us have lost our way as Christians, still a significant segment has come and evolved, including, I want to say, Walter Kim. He's Korean American and president, executive director of the National Association of Evangelicals, one of the largest, most influential Christian evangelical institutions representing this country. So with that, I have more to share, but that's some synopsis.
Thank you so much, Hyepin. I mean, there's the Korean church, Korean Christians, especially here in the country, America, are so prevalent, and I think you did a great job in the time that you had. Our third panelist is Rev Dr. Daniel D. Lee. He's the academic dean of the Center for Asian American Theology and Ministry and assistant professor of theology and Asian American ministry at Fuller Theological Seminary. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you for having me, Ken, and thanks for inviting me. So when Ken invited me to this panel, and I thought about this, and I was like, well, how can I think about the role that Christianity has played in the Asian American Pacific Islander communities? In the book that I wrote, the double particularity, I talk about 4 different ways in which Asian American churches in general kind of serve the community, right? How does it function? They function as a contextual community in a sense of dealing with heritage. They kind of help continue on the heritage. They make help people in the congregation connect to their Asian heritage to some degree with the language as well. They also help, obviously, that Hyepin talked about, as a transitional community, helping people through migration experience. And that can be a really disruptive and kind of traumatizing experience for a lot of people. So all throughout history, churches have helped people sort through and kind of transition through their migration experience. And they can also be kind of a missional community in terms of reaching out to the community, reaching out to the neighborhood. All that kind of can be, helping people kind of figure out how they can be neighbors, reaching out to not only their Asian American neighbors, but also the non-Asian American neighbors as well. And in a sense, I think even without churches realizing that, our immigrant churches and also our Asian American churches, they kind of also serve as liberational communities, in the sense of, even if we're not politically active, to kind of protect us from the racism that's out there as well. I think a lot of people don't realize the fact that the reason why Asian American churches continue on, even though sometimes the language is not an issue, or even culture is not an issue, is the fact that it provides a place where you don't have to think about being different. They don't have to kind of face all the kind of slight everyday microaggressions and racism. They can worship in a place where they can kind of focus on God and have the message that kind of connects them and affirm who they are, and a place where they can bring all of themselves, all of who they are, to the worship of God. Otherwise, what ends up happening is you basically end up presenting your, what I call kind of a public self, right? Because Asian Americans can kind of have a bifurcation of private and public, where the public self, because people always say this, like, well, why do Asian American churches matter when our schools and our work is all integrated, all multicultural? So should Asian American churches exist? And I always say, well, often what ends up happening is those spaces, mainstream kind of American society spaces, end up being spaces where they're not hospitable to all of who we are. So in a sense, we kind of edit ourselves to make ourselves more white normative. And in that sense, if our churches were like that, then we wouldn't be able to bring all of ourselves and connect the gospel to all of who we are. So in that sense, I think Asian American churches serve a very critical function, and I think it would continue to serve a very critical function. I think a lot of people are talking about multi-ethnic churches and how they'll take over everything, but there are theological reasons for why that actually these churches have served a critical role and will continue to do so. Now, I think generally just talking about churches. I mean, because at the Asian American Center where I work, and we here you go. I'm gonna share this our link to what the Asian American Center looks like. I mean, we are a center that basically deals with all Asian Americans, right? So we talk about Southeast Asians, South Asians, and East Asians as well. And I see even my Southeast Asian, like Hmong American or Cambodian American, or even my South or Indian American, students, like people who have Marthoma background, or Indian kind of Pentecostal background. They're just trying to figure out, how does a church function? Because a church actually obviously is a spiritual and a religious center, but a lot of Asian American churches function, and immigrant churches function as a community center as well. And this can be actually good and bad. There's actually tension to it. If you grew up in an Asian American church, you kind of know what I'm talking about. The fact that I used to always kind of joke around the fact that if I didn't bow correctly in my Korean American church, I would be called a bad Christian. And I'm like, what? I can see why. I mean, there's a number of connections why you would get there, but it's also these churches end up being community centers and in a sense support the community, but also kind of to continue on and disseminate our heritage, Asian heritage as well. And in that sense, it's good in the sense that we help each other out, the fact that our community can kind of function and we can kind of support each other, and also find kind of refuge in a sense where we can kind of bring all of ourselves, connect to each other, especially in places where there are very few Asian Americans around, right? So, but in a more critical sense, it can actually be problematic because, and if you're familiar with the idea of silent exodus, which is the idea that's been around since like the 90s, with a lot of the second generation or third generation kind of leaving the church and realizing, and what they're rejecting is not necessarily Christian doctrine per se, but they're rejecting a particular form of Asian heritage that's being perpetuated and reinforced. And because of that, they react against that. They feel like their church is kind of suffocating them. In a lot of sense, I think they end up leaving the church altogether as well, because they just feel like it's all intertwined altogether. So in that sense, how does the church function not only as a spiritual center, but also this community center? I think that's a really important question. It's become even more important question as we think about what's happening now and all the kind of political upheaval that's happening. Because so many, at least in terms of the post-1965 immigration of that wave of churches, so many of the pastors have been trained in kind of white normative educational system, right? Just kind of standard educational system that doesn't really help us understand what the Asian American context is. And so churches often ends up being, along with the gospel, a place where it helps people assimilate to mainstream American culture. And this is where I've seen, right? This is where we've actually struggled altogether as Asian Americans, because we are not understanding where our context is. We're not really understanding our history. One of the things I talk about with my students is that our Asian American students know more about Black history than Asian American history. We just don't have a very high critical self-awareness about where we come from. And actually American history and American studies is a huge kind of a gulf, like, within US society. This is a little article I wrote talking about the fact that a lot of people think about Asian Americanness in a very individualistic way, like me and my family. And it's very difficult for people to kind of think about their family, their ethnic heritage, their racial heritage, and all kind of where we fit in the world history. And because we think so individualistically, and this is not just because of how we think, it's part of our mainstream American society kind of an education to think, help everybody think in a very individualistic way. The problem is we can't understand where we fit in to our, as a community, or even when we talk about racism, where does this fit in? Like, we have no historical awareness. I think having that broader historical awareness helps us to kind of engage and understand where the church has to go. So if you think about this, where the church has to go, and kind of be more aware and how do we kind of have more of a developed theology for the future? Like, because a lot of churches, I would say, are socially and culturally Asian American, but there's a failure here to understand why we are theologically Asian American. Why are we here together? What does it really mean for? I mean, even if you don't go to Asian American church, what would be the reason and purpose for us to have Asian American churches? There's a theological reason for doing so, and the theological reason helps us to discern even what's happening in politics as well, because theology kind of guides us to think about how does gospel connect with sociological and theological kind of realities that are out there. I want to share our podcast. We've been trying to figure out how do we help people to understand what the Asian American Christian history, just how it fits in with Asian American history altogether. Have a more of a critical understanding of where we fit in. And I mean, other panelists here talked about this thing, that as Asian Americans, and not only Asian American theologians, but Asian American scholars altogether, as they've looked at US history, they said, wait a minute, like US history as how it's taught really isn't beneficial. It's actually not even true. To some degree, there's so much propaganda in terms of how every kind of national curriculum, whether it be, I think about like Japanese curriculum, and a lot of people complain about the fact that Japanese educational curriculum, how they teach World War II is totally different than how China and Korea would teach it. Well, it turns out that even it's like that in every country, right? And how US presents itself is actually really vastly different than how other nations kind of see it. And we kind of, I think, without the critical understanding of what US history is and where Asian Americans fit in, we can kind of just totally absorb that uncritically. And that really helps us, that really doesn't help us to understand where, as Christians and as individuals, how we should live our lives and how to make sense of what's happening in the US today. So that's one of the reasons why we do the work that we do at the Asian American Center, for churches to not only be socially and culturally Asian American, but to have critical understanding of theologically what does it mean to have Asian American churches, even for us to be spiritual and community centers. How do we make sense of where we are, and how do we have a faithful witness that gives people life, right? I mean, the gospel is all the good news that we talk about as Christians is giving people life that comes from God. And how do we make sure that the church is on the right side of history? Church is actually doing good work that gives life to not only our individuals, our community, but also our society as well, right? That whether it be civil rights, or whether it be social justice that are out there, or racial justice, making sure that the church is actually doing the right thing, discerning what's happening, right? Faithfully discerning, but also being on the right side to make sure that we're actually part of God's kingdom work. Not only evangelism, but also doing the work of justice as well. So I think those are some things I think about when we think about the impact and the role that Christianity has played in the Asian American community, Asian American Pacific Islander communities, and also the role that it continues to play.
Okay. Thank you. Back in here. Yeah. Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you to all the panelists. Daniel, I think your last couple of statements there leads to how we're going to spend the latter portion, so we can bring the other panelists back on. The whole idea of what role is Christianity and Asian American churches going to play going forward, next 10, 20 years. I think, I mean, our daughter's 22. I think her generation, millennial, Gen Z, whatever you want to call it, they, without maybe having all the definitional understanding that you just gave us, they want something more out of going to church, if that makes sense, right? And to use the phrase of the day, they're already more woke than I was growing up, and so they are, I don't know about demanding, but they're expecting more, not just from Asian American church, but just Christianity and what have you. And so I want to open up a discussion for all four of us to what do we see some of the challenges going forward. I think as we're as a country coming out of this pandemic, tiptoeing, I'm not assuming that it's going to be church as normal. I think a lot of people have gotten out of the habit of it. And some of us miss the community aspect of it, but there's been a lot of justice things going on as well. And so I think pastors, especially Asian American pastors, are being incredibly naive if they just think, well, we'll just pick up where we left off, when where we left off was already problematic. So I want us to, in the time that we have, let's talk about what we see needing to happen. What are some practical things that Asian American Christians, leaders, pastors need to be engaged in order that the church, Asian American church, actually has a place going forward that is growing and deserves to have an audience. So who wants to start us off?
I'll start off.
All right.
So I used to be part on the board of the FTE, Fund for Theological Exploration. And one of the things that they highlighted was how many millennials are leaving church. And yet one of the things that is very important to them was about social justice. And yet the church has no platform to enable that desire to be active, for church to be relevant in the broader space. And I have to say that for, well, you know what? Perhaps churches are not providing that space, but I would say in the last year and a half, I've seen this tremendous explosion of Asian American Christians coming out and connecting together. So groups like Asian American Christian Collaborative, CAHF, Progressive Asian American Christians. There's also Asia Rising, and a few other groups have just kind of exploded. And there is a great space for social justice / social activism. And yet, again, as mentioned in the church space, I find that in my work, particularly as we have a great working relationship with local and national stakeholders, including the White House. And when they ask to convene, to get my help to help convene national Asian Christian leaders, especially pastors, you know, that's kind of a space where there's like a question mark. And I find it a constant struggle to identify and get their consistent attention of the value and importance of engaging in this space. And so going back in my work that I've done for now this year, 20 years, I think around year 16, I had this crisis moment of my calling, because each time I would go after certain opportunities, advocate for our community, and I turn around and I would think that there would be the community there, including pastors with whom I've had longstanding relationships. And each time it will feel like I will be starting on first base. And I wondered, like, what's wrong with this picture, God? What am I doing wrong? You know, and what I came to realize though was that beyond kind of that theological influence of good Christians don't get active in the, you know, social justice / political activism, that they just don't have the infrastructure nor the training. So to be active in the broader social justice space, you need first relationships. You know, I think about Queen Esther. When the Hebrew people got in trouble, it was because she had the relationship with the king, that she could call for a meeting, get the meeting, and when she advocated, she had his trust to be able to turn her advocacy actually into policy. And so without bloodshed, without money, without effort, you know, the Hebrew people, you know, got saved, right? And unfortunately for many Asian pastors, we've not received that training, right? In which to understand how to get out, how to partner with the broader community and build those relationships. So I think that's one piece. Second piece is that, again, it's through the relationships that our work gets noticed. And I think about Matthew 5:16, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and praise your Father who's in heaven. And unfortunately, we don't have the relationships for many of our pastors. And so no one sees the good works that we're doing. And so we, again, become irrelevant. Of leaders who are active in this space, they need skills such as government relations, media relations, right? Fundraising, advocacy, all those things. They also need a mindset about leveraging partnerships. They need the tools such as media relations, right? Media release, you know, fundraising template, whatever. And again, the mindset that you could do better, right? By going out into the world, leveraging those resources, those partnerships. And so for me, when I had that crisis of calling and realizing that our pastors lack those skill sets that's required by stakeholders to be successful in this space, and to create a space where our young folks who are so hungry, right, who want God, who want the church to show up in the world with God's light, that they needed these training. And so we created a boot camp called the C2 Leadership Institute. And it's like literally a Cinderella pre and post fairy godmother. You're going to get all the tool set, your 1-minute pitch, your sponsorship template, but also the relationship, but more importantly, the mindset that really, oh, wow, you know what? These stakeholders are really important in my ministry and a pathway to making impact in the world.
Daniel.
Yeah, Bayer, if I can kind of speak over here, I would say there is an assumption that the Christianity that what we're getting in our churches and seminaries is what we should seek for is this pure gospel, right? And I think a lot of times when we think about politics, we say, well, you know what, you don't need politics because you need pure gospel. But we don't realize the fact that the pure gospel that actually is conservative or liberal, or even what's balanced, it actually already has political values already baked into it, right? So a lot of the seminaries, what we're giving people is kind of a white normative gospel that basically kind of keeps all the power structures as it is. And this is actually, I think when we have a better understanding of history, we realize, wait a minute, this is actually not how church has always been. This is how theology has always been. Without kind of understanding that, we can kind of look at what's happening politically and saying, oh my gosh, we don't want that. We don't want these radical changes. We want a clean, pure gospel that's only spiritual. But we don't realize that thing itself is already corrupted with all these kind of political values already, right? With values that are there. So it's not neutral. I think about this idea, even conservative or liberal, even being balanced, like how do we, we don't want all these radical ideas. But once again, I mean, I really look at MLK now. I mean, I think about like MLK and the fact that people think, oh yeah, why don't we these people now, the socialists like MLK? And of course, all of us know historically, Martin Luther King Jr. was considered absolute radical and like a crazy nut, right? I mean, nobody supported him. I think we don't realize the fact that what's happening in society may be a way in which God's working. And we need to kind of critically look at our churches and our theology as well. And to some degree, I mean, I so appreciate what Hyepin does with the C2 leadership, because it gives you concrete skills to do all this work. Even more fundamentally, I think theologically, the question is this part of our faith? Is this work in our society part of our faith? And to make sure that we actually reorganize what the gospel is. It's not just for us to all float into heaven, but we believe in the God of the resurrection. We believe in the God of creation, that all these physical things around us actually matter. It's not a gospel of private life only, but the gospel that changes all of our society as well. Unless we actually think about the gospel differently and preach that holistic gospel that transforms all of who we are, all of society, we're going to basically think in a very narrow way and think these other ideas about changing society is actually something that's radical, when in fact, it's fundamentally a gospel message as well. So that's basically what I would say. The theological training is really, really important to kind of rethink what the gospel is again.
Now, Bayer, you had mentioned near the end of your presentation that you've always kind of found yourself in this liminal space. The Dallas Seminary guy who went to Columbia, and then your English-speaking congregation at China. I mean, from what Hyepin and Daniel have said, I mean, Hyepin's talking about the equipping with practical skills to actually be able to go out and make a difference and shine the light. And Daniel's talking about, and we have to have an informed theological mindset that we're not just kind of, I mean, in your neck of the country, and especially with the Chinese churches, do you see the potential for these things to come together like that or not?
Well, it's a real kind of dilemma because I'm 70 years old. I was trying to look for a younger intern and, groom somebody into the role of the church here in New York, actually. I think there are some, the younger one that I knew, they were very enthusiastic, comes out of the Southern Baptist Seminary, where the seminary actually, turned the ship entirely back to more conservative. And so they are well received by churches because they do the work that was expected by church, discipleship and grow the congregation and focus on the congregation. And also when I talk about the greater movement like COAHP, and they're still alive, those organizations that came from the 70s from Lausanne, right? It's still very focused mission on evangelism, right? And not so much about the social politic. In fact, they want to stay away from it, except for abortion and the gay issue. So in my, so as a Dallas grad in New York, I had to get I had to be re-educated. So I started going to Princeton, taking courses. And that's why I met Shelley Hume she dragged me into the Asian Americans movement in the late 80s and early 90s. And that's why I came to know the Asian American leaders. Now, with Corky Lee, it's radical shift. I attribute him the gift of pastor. Not that he's a Christian pastor, but the way he's always on the ground, he's doing COVID. He's out taking the subway. And so he is a genuine guy that cares for people. And he's got a network of followers that cries when he, so I got to know him and said, wow, this guy's a pastor, right? He's a shepherd. He's out in the street, he's caring. So I find that the people that I know through Corky in Chinatown are one who are genuinely care for the community. They provide food, they're not fakes, right? A guy, opened his store right on Mott Street. He's a restaurant. He's a food supply owner. He produced meals, hundreds and thousands of them given away, and he's a hero, right? So for me, I thought about doing that, but that's not what I, trained to do. I try to do it, and I propose it. In my earlier days with the church, evangelical churches, they said, this is not what we do. And I also proposed it recently to my deacon. He's probably watching. I said, wait, wouldn't it be a great idea to just open up the church and put tables out in front of our church on Pell Street and feed the people? What? Then he worried about, well, what about the law governing, church in terms of food, and what if somebody gets sick, right? You have to have people to process it. You can't just, give out food. So in some way, going back to our exposure, right, to be recognized by the public. Now, because of Corky, right, I got to know so many people, not of my initiative. I'm dragged into the community and I have to do it. And I find myself doing it, coming out of somewhat retirement. So I don't know if that's the way. Now, if a pastor that's hired by a church to do that, he'll get fired by the church. He's got no time to prepare a sermon. He's got no time to disciple people. He's got no time to organize the church. I was wondering what Jesus, when Jesus, he waited, 30 years, and then 3 years, he's out on the street every day. Right, he's with the community, with people. He still got crucified, right? So I don't know what the future is. I mean, in terms of Christianity, is the church finished, right? In terms of in terms of the efficacy of this, is there another transition to another way of faith, right? So when I have,
there's a couple of the panelists want to respond to you in the short time that you have left. I'm going to start with Daniel and then Hyepin.
Yeah, just a short comment. I mean, Bayer talks about the Lushan movement, and actually, what's interesting is that when Lushan movement actually started by John Stott, and John Stott was one of the main authors of the Lushan Covenant. It was actually direct reaction to the liberation movement, which actually was impacted by Marxism. And they said, well, let's not do it that way. But what they're talking about is important. So what Lushan says isn't the fact that social justice is important. They basically say evangelism has to be, we can't lose evangelism, but evangelism and social work goes together. That's basically what the fundamental Lushan movement is. Now, what ends up happening with the American church is the fact that American fundamentalism is so tied to American individualism and also right-wing politics. It's actually corrupted even the Lushan movement as well. So that's basically what we have in America. It's not even the global Lushan movement that we have, because once again, Lushan movement was in direct response to the liberation theology that's out there and saying what they're saying is important. How do we do it in such a way that really respects what the gospel is? So it's not like just to do social justice. It's the fact that this is a gospel work that involves preaching to the soul, spirit, and the body all together. So I think it's really important, the fact that people understand the Lushan movement correctly. And they read somebody like, John Stott, who actually wrote the Lushan Covenant. I just want to kind of make that clear.
Yeah, thanks for that.
So much.
Yeah, thank you. Hyepin, thoughts about social justice?
Yeah, so I saw a question about denominational rules that, getting involved in the social justice movement, that it depends on each denomination. And I just want to respond that is true. That is the official policy per se. But the other day I was reading the Bible, and there was an individual, I can't remember now if he was crippled or he had a withered hand. And basically the people surrounding them were saying, hey, it's the Sabbath, you shouldn't be, healing on Sabbath day. And Jesus basically responds about saving a life, the importance of saving a life. And I think, ultimately at the end of the day, whether it was the women who during Moses's time, that refused to obey the Pharaoh's command to kill lives, to again, different examples throughout history, that I think at the end of the day, God is about love. And so what is our response, Christian response to the needs in our community, and how do we navigate that space well? And I think there are guidelines, because even in the feeding ministry, there are many churches who are doing it. And so to be able to learn examples of how to do that. And also like the separation of church and state is another one where there's a lot of really well-written guidelines where you don't have to, be in bed with the government per se, and follow at their beck and call, but how to be able to lead, set the table in such a way that you're still a light to the world without compromising your faith. But you be wise as stewards, right, as the serpent, to leverage the resources of the world as well.
Well, we're at the end of our time. I want to thank all of our panelists. As the moderator, I have the luxury of having the last word. I will say that I think I'm always a very pragmatic person, as much as I'm an optimist. I think the future is still up for grabs. I think there are going to be those who want to continue in the traditional way and just want to emphasize piety and evangelism and what have you. No one's going to stop them. But as a father who has a millennial, you are not going to make that generation get excited about that. And so I think there's going to be a camp that it's still about correct doctrine and being able to tick off those boxes. But I think this current younger generation is looking for kind of gospel behavior as really the authentic. But it's still, as Danny and I were just talking before we started this, it still remains to be seen. So what form will that take? I see people leaving churches because they're disgruntled and disenchanted, but I don't necessarily see them reorganizing into something. I want to believe in my heart of hearts, in my spirit, that the Holy Spirit is up to something, maybe like the Reformation, and right, because God's not finished, And I just want to personally be, and I want whatever church I'm part of to still be open to the Spirit of God, even if the Spirit is making me uncomfortable, making me reconsider things. And I think it's going to involve being willing to take some stuff apart and see God put it back together.
Ken, could I just say one thing, because there's a lot of
Sure.
questions on the social divide. So just real quickly, I have been involved working with the White House, with national, Asian Christian leaders across the country on many fronts, particularly on the racial divide. And yet one of the optics is around, Black on Asian crime. And in essence, at the end of the day, this morning, I had this very powerful moment. It felt like God led. We had a convening with literally just a handful of Black clergy with Asian clergy. And I felt like, I don't know, amongst all the other forums that I've been with, even Christian leaders, it was such a genuine, authentic moment of solidarity / God-led. I really felt like, wow, you know what? Some of the people in the room was like Walter Kim, who's the president of the National Evangelical Association, for him to be in that role, such as time as this. To Reverend Mark Whitlock, who is the the senior pastor of the largest historic AME church, whom I've worked with, right, was very active during the LA riots. His church with Pastor Murray was the model of, the organization. And even the other day, I was talking about how our organization would have never been if Mark had not invited me to join his effort, and all that happened to this day. Wow. To Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner, to Skillen Williams, I get the mixed names, last name always confused, but just her influence and role and her relationship with Joshua Dubois, to Bishop Ulmer and his influence, and how this is all converging together. And like I said, I felt amongst all the efforts that I've been part of, including Christian leaders, it just felt like, wow, this is an example of true Christian reconciliation, healing, solidarity in God's presence and spirit. So I just want to, and it gave me hope as a Christian, and I think others in the room as well. So I know that all of us do believe that God isn't finished with his job, but this moment, I just want to share of the ray of hope that is to come even in a bigger and greater way as well.
Well, thank you very much for sharing of that. Christina, I'm going to toss it back to you to wrap this up.
So thank you everyone so much for coming to tonight's webinar. I really enjoyed listening to your talk. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Reverend Fong. We will have 2 more days of AAPI Heritage Month, which means 2 more webinars. You can join us tomorrow at 8 p.m. for a talk about Norman Mineta, and join us on May 31st at 8 p.m. for a Memorial Day tribute to American veterans. And visit CAHF.us for more information and to register for those Zoom webinars. And thank you all so much for attending this webinar. We'll end it for now. Goodbye and good night to all the attendees. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.